I think I'm gonna remember 2023 as the year my life fell apart. I started transitioning the year before, and though I thought that would be it, like finally working up the courage to start that process would be the biggest thing to happen for a while, I now know it was just setting up all of the other dominoes to fall. Last year I struggled with some health problems, a few fallouts with friends, and an existential crisis that resulted in me quitting the one thing that I thought I really had going for my career, a YouTube channel I ran for a few years about Disney music. And I quit that on the day I got bottom surgery, which both made sense and also delivered the final blow to my life as I knew it. As you can see, I ended up rebranding the channel, but it took me a while to figure out what to do next. Since the operation, I've been picking up the pieces and putting my life back together. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about Snow White. I had my operation in Munich, Germany, a city with a monument to the Brothers Grimm. But when I looked out my hospital room window each morning and hummed "Someday My Prince Will Come," I wasn't thinking about their version of the story. Disney's Snow White is a movie about, a princess. After losing both of her parents, Snow White is living with her stepmother, the evil queen, who forces her to work as a maid in fear that Snow White will eventually outshine her beauty and become the fairest in the land. When this fear comes true and she falls in love with the prince, the evil queen tries to kill her, failing at first via a huntsman who can't bring himself to do it, and then sort of succeeding by putting her into a coma with a poison apple, thinking that she'll be buried alive. However, the evil queen is eventually killed, and the prince returns to give Snow White true love's first kiss, which brings her back to life, and they ride off into the distance for happily ever after. The Disney retelling of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs isn't too far off from the original Brothers Grimm story, but there are a few notable changes. In the original, the queen tries to kill Snow White 3 times, but the Disney version only includes the first and third attempts, even making the first one less gruesome. And though the queen dies in both versions, in the original she's forced to dance to her death in hot iron shoes, while in the Disney one she's killed by a boulder, removing the responsibility from any of the characters. These changes didn't happen for no reason. Just like the Grimm version in a way represented the time in which it was created, the Disney movie adjusted the story to reflect the values of the US and of Walt Disney himself. Nowadays, it exists in a sort of in-between space. It's an antiquated movie from the late 30s, but it's also one of the films from that time period that's still considered an essential family-friendly classic. And the character of Snow White is viewed by some to represent a problematic archetype that should be left in the past, but she's also a character that children can meet while visiting Disneyland today. In light of Disney's recent 100th anniversary, it's easy to see Snow White as the thing that really changed the company's trajectory forever. It was the first of its kind, a feature-length animated film to use the cell animation style that was popular in 1930s Hollywood. And for Disney, a company that at the time was struggling financially, making the remarkably expensive film was a huge risk. But of course, it was a huge success, and it cemented Disney's spot as a key player in US culture. And though they took from a German fairy tale, their approach to storytelling would set a new, distinctly US American standard. In the 86 years since its release, Disney's Snow White has come to represent many different things. It's been the catalyst for one man's ascent to stardom, the background to tragedy, and a representation of international politics in the mid-20th century. And for the past few months, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. So I'm going to try and find out why. Snow White is a movie about many things, but it's also a movie about me.
Just whistle while you work, and cheerfully together we can tidy up the place. So hum a merry tune. It won't take long when there's a song to help you set the pace. And as you see through, imagine that the room is someone that you love, and soon you'll find you're dancing to that tune. When hearts are high, the time will fly, so whistle while you work.
How long was Snow White in production for?
I actually started to
planned the picture around 1935.
You said you were bringing a modern edge to it.
I just mean that it's no longer 1937, and we absolutely wrote a Snow White that is
not going to be saved by the prince.
That the soulless woke warriors complain that Snow White was kissed without her consent.
Of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
I'm sure the boys and girls in the whole world are going to be very happy when they find out that the daddy of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is going to get this beautiful statue. Aren't you proud of it, Mr. Disney?
She is not a revolutionary character, but she's spirited.
Were your films principally designed for children?
Well, no, you have to appeal to the adult, or, the adults have the money, the children don't have any money.
But so that there was nothing childish in your intent?
No, we sort of designed the films to appeal to ourselves.
What do stories tell us? Despite watching the same films I did when I was younger, I now relate to them in completely different ways. And Disney movies are one of those things that will probably always mean a lot to me. But exactly what that means continues to change as I do. But to paraphrase Jenny Nicholson, maybe that's the nature of fairy tales. Often exaggerated stories in service of a particular moral that is purposefully vague, allowing anyone to see themselves in it. While going through transition, the same stories I was already familiar with have told me different things. And when thinking about Snow White, I was understanding it in new ways. I had always appreciated the visual aesthetic and the music, but I'd never really thought much about the dialogue itself, or the story, or the ways in which Disney changed the story. And while thinking about those things, it was clear that I had changed as well. I got sober about 3 years ago. I didn't completely destroy my life, but it always felt like I was riding on the edge of a cliff. And at some point I realized I cannot keep poisoning myself. I realized that I was very much an alcoholic. So I stopped drinking, and that was when my life radically changed, because I think once I stopped having this thing to lean on all the time, I had to reckon with some questions that I had been ignoring. That was when the gender stuff really started coming out, because I didn't have the same method that I previously used to run away from that. And so, I don't know, I've been grateful to have gotten through that. But ever since then, my relationship with substances, or just really anything, like even just caffeine, anything that changes my state of mind, I've been super sensitive to. And one of the interesting things about that is that when you stop drinking or stop using substances, when you stop doing that, for me, it was not the easiest thing to do, but it only comes back sometimes. But when it comes back, it's like, oh, I am definitely an alcoholic. Like, maybe that's something that will never go away. Maybe I will always just be living my life resisting, and living then becomes like an act of resistance. And for me, that popped up when I was at the hospital for bottom surgery, because a part of my sobriety story is that when I was at the hospital, I was in a lot of pain. And something that you do when you're at a hospital and you're in a lot of pain is that you take pain meds. But in general, I am incredibly avoidant of that type of stuff. And so I really tried to resist. And I remember so clearly one night at like 2:30 in the morning, it was the first night after I had the operation. They came in like every 2 hours, the nurses did, just like to check in on us and make sure that everything was fine. And I was getting like ice packs down there replaced and stuff like that. And all of a sudden I felt like a warm rush, and I was like, oh my God, am I bleeding? And so I called in the nurse, and she swapped out the ice pack. She was like, let me know if anything changes. And a few minutes later, more rushing, more gushing, it felt like. And so I called her in again, and she looked at it and she was like, oh my God, we have to get you to a doctor. They wheeled me down to the gynecology office, and in an odd turn of events, which is honestly the theme with this sort of thing, is that these moments of like doing something new and this exciting thrill to be living your life in a different way, it's always paired with like these harrowing experiences of terror. And in this experience, I was bleeding after a major operation at 2:30 in the morning, but it was also my first time in a gynecological chair. So you gotta take the good with the bad. And when I was in this gynecological chair and I was being offered pain meds by these doctors, and I was telling them, please, I can't, I just can't. And they kept assuring me, like, we're doing this fine, like, you have to trust us, we are being responsible. And I was just crying. I just couldn't handle it. Eventually, I ended up giving in to the pain meds. A few days later, I managed to get by just like taking Novocaine, as they say in Germany. I don't think it's available in the US, but I took that for a few days and that helped me manage things. But then I got a really bad infection that was causing just indescribable levels of pain. And for that, I had to take and it was really scary to me. And when I thought about Snow White, I kept thinking about this image of the poison apple, and specifically that scene in the movie where the evil queen is making the apple and she dips it and you see the skull before it turns red. I just think that is such compelling imagery.
Look on the skin, the symbol of what lies within.
And I couldn't stop thinking about that while I was at the hospital, as I was being tempted by these pain meds that I knew would help me but could also severely hurt me if I wasn't careful. And at the same time, I had just hurt myself. I had just gone through this incredibly traumatic thing to become a new person.
If I start, I'm scared of what I'll write. What if I say something that'll change my life? What if I see something buried below? Something I didn't know I know. I knew a boy who once ran away, took a torch to yesterday, trying to remember how things seemed before he was haunted by a dream. A white room and a bloody bed, a poison apple drenched in red, a promise fleeting out of sight, across the street for the night, screaming beautiful crystal scorn, the rotten pain of being reborn, the threat of giving as you take, the sacred sign of being awake. Seeing you as you see me, no reason not to be. Wilting flowers in a vase, the same feeling but a different place. The thought of knowing I could hurt you in ways I think I'd never choose. The thought of falling into hell, the thought of setting fire to myself. Sometimes I think the birds sing too loud, sometimes not enough. Sometimes I think I should assert myself, but sometimes I just stop.
Snow White is a movie about Walt Disney. Nostalgia is a key part of the Disney brand, and it's been there since basically the beginning, so it makes sense that when deciding which story to adapt, he went back to his roots. I don't know why I picked Snow White. It's a thing I remembered as a kid. I saw Marguerite Clark in it in Kansas City one time when I was a newsboy. They had a big showing for all the newsboys, and I went and saw Snow White. It was probably one of my first big feature pictures I'd ever seen. That was back in 1916 or something, somewhere way back. But anyway, to me, I thought it was a perfect story. I had the sympathetic dwarfs and things, I had the prince and the girl, the romance. I had the heavy. I just thought it was a perfect story. As I've already mentioned, the version of Snow White that Disney chose to tell has some changes from the original Brothers Grimm tale, and that played a huge role in how the film fit within US American society of the time.
And old sourpuss here is Grumpy, the woman hater.
The Evil Queen's final design was based off the movie She, while the design of Snow White herself clearly takes influence from stars of the day like Marguerite Clark and Mary Pickford, the former of whom was in the Snow White movie Walt referenced, and the latter of whom had already worked with Disney for an unfinished adaptation of Alice in Wonderland. Adriana Caselotti was recruited to be the voice of Snow White, and her performance contributed to the film's portrayal of effortless femininity that fit within archetypes of the time.
Oh, it's adorable! Just like a doll's house.
With modern hindsight, it's easy to see Snow White as bland and passive. Her beauty isn't defined by her view of herself, but some inherent truth revealed by a magic mirror. And though she wants more, she doesn't go searching for it herself. She only runs away after the huntsman tells her to. But personally, I think this reading of her character is pretty unfair to the cultural context of the time, and it projects unrealistic expectations onto the movie. She can be passive, but she's also very motivated and hardworking. Even though her wants and ambitions play into gender stereotypes, within the context of the story, they're uniquely hers, and she's presented as a character who's driven and ambitious. And within the context of the film coming out during the Great Depression, her relentless optimism was admirable during a time when many US Americans were struggling. The movie also represented Walt's ambitions. Making the first feature-length cell animation film was not only a lot of work, but also expensive.
I didn't know what I had or what would happen or anything. We had the family fortune, we had everything wrapped up in Snow White.
The invention of the multiplane camera also allowed animators to reach a never-before-seen level of detail and immersion that would change the animation industry forever. Though with hindsight, it's easy to see why Snow White was such a success. Making it was still a huge risk and was very much a make-or-break situation for the company. And this movie also played a role in Walt coming into his own as a sort of paternal figure in US culture who was a storyteller. His drive to create family-friendly entertainment that would truly be enjoyable for all ages is something that has propelled Disney for the last 100 years. And even his decision to curate and adjust a fairy tale for the context of a society looking for escapism shows how he was able to use art for comfort and catharsis. But Snow White's influence didn't exist in a vacuum, and while the entertainment industry was changing, so was diplomacy, and the film would come to represent something entirely different within a global context. The Comedian Harmonists were a close harmony group who were not only one of the most famous musical acts in Weimar Republic-era Germany, but they also had an international presence. However, when the Nazis seized power in the early 30s, their future became uncertain, and the group eventually split in half, with the Jewish members fleeing the country and forming a new group in Vienna. And while working in London in 1938, they recorded selections from Snow White. Snow White was an international phenomenon, and the German dub premiered that year in Austria and Switzerland, but not in Nazi Germany, although it almost did. Adolf Hitler was a fan of Disney, and Snow White was reportedly one of his favorite movies, and when Disney began making international dubs of the film, they were in talks to make a German version as well. The dub was made in Amsterdam with a cast featuring many Jewish actors who had fled to Germany. And when propaganda filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl came to Hollywood to promote her film Olympia, Walt Disney met with her despite an ongoing boycott. The exact details of this meeting are vague. We know that she was shown an in-progress sequence from Fantasia, and Walt expressed interest in seeing Olympia, but then decided not to. But we also know what she said about him afterward. The meeting occurred after the Night of Broken Glass, and though Walt claimed to not know who she was, evidence suggests otherwise. And after the meeting, the German dub of Snow White would never be released in Nazi Germany, though a copy was found among the Third Reich's possessions after the war. And despite US American movies eventually being banned by the Nazis, in 1941, a group called the Ghetto Swingers performed a medley of songs from Snow White at the Theresienstadt concentration camp.
The so-called Ghetto Swingers, a very good jazz orchestra, jazz group that performed, among other things, in the so-called coffee house, were playing a medley from Snow White. The composer of the music was a man whose name was Frank Churchill. And the people who organized this immediately understood, if we write Frank Churchill, the SS might misunderstand it as some kind of provocation. They simply suppressed the name of the composer and wrote You are going to hear a medley from Snow White by Walt Disney.
Allegations about Walt Disney being anti-Semitic are highly contested, and anecdotes from Jewish employees range from saying there was nothing discriminatory about him to claiming they saw him at a meeting of the German-American Bund. And while speculating, many today point to Disney's later anti-Nazi propaganda films as exoneration, while others point out that anti-Semitism did play a role in U.S. conservatism of the time beyond just Nazi-sympathetic groups. But regardless of who is telling the story, what we do know is that there was a period of time in which Disney's Snow White represented something much different outside of the US. Regardless of whether Walt himself was an anti-Semite or not, he had willingly, even enthusiastically, embraced them and cast his feet with them. And having done so, regardless of the awards and charitable contributions to Jewish organizations, he would never be able to cleanse himself of the taint. For many today, Disney's Snow White is a movie about misogyny. It perpetuates archaic tropes, and therefore it shouldn't be shown to kids. And as much as Disney wants to uncritically celebrate the work of Walt Disney, the recent wave of live-action remakes has shown that they also have no problem updating their stories in response to modern criticism. Most of the time, I think this just results in bizarre overcorrections of problems that weren't really there to begin with. And with the upcoming Snow White remake, it seems like there will be similar changes.
You said you were bringing a modern edge to it on stage. What do you mean by that?
I just mean that it's no longer 1937, and we absolutely wrote a Snow White that
She's not going to be saved by the prince.
She's not going to be saved by the prince, and she's not going to be dreaming about true love. She's dreaming about becoming the leader she knows she can be.
But there has been criticism of other parts of the movie as well, such as the trope of dwarves in fairy tales and how that perpetuates discrimination. Disney seems intent on addressing this and has changed the title to just focus on Snow White, but that seems to have missed the point of the criticism, which was about why they feel the need to revitalize such a story in the first place. And that brings up an important aspect of how Disney functions. Nostalgia is very important to the company, so even if there are changes made or even entire movies removed from circulation, it's usually done in a way that's indirect and vague. But with Snow White often being remembered as the original Disney fairy tale, making significant changes comes with the added context of changing the foundation of one of the most important aspects of Disney storytelling today. Since Disney's Snow White was released, the idea of Disney princesses has turned from a trope into a brand. And with that has also come a lot of cultural discussions about what it means to be a princess and how, or even if, that can fit within feminism. If Disney wants people to continue buying their products for their children, they need to walk the fine line between embracing archaic tropes while also emphasizing agency. So Snow White has been neatly folded into a lineup of Disney princesses who are girl bosses, who take control of their own lives, and who are inspirational. And when you go to a Disney park today, that's what you'll see. A ride telling the story of Snow White is never far away from a gift shop filled with Disney princess merch. While I don't personally think the story needed to be updated to fit Snow White into modern-day feminism, I also don't really have a huge issue with how Disney has been going about it. When Halle Bailey was saying similar things regarding The Little Mermaid, I was a bit confused about how the movie would play out, especially given the lyrical changes about consent. I think it's a bit silly to overcorrect fairy tales like they are meant to directly represent real-life morals, but the changes made in The Little Mermaid were pretty insignificant at the end of the day, so I'm curious to see how Disney will do a similar thing with Snow White. And while of course the changes have fit well into the current anti-woke Disney outrage machine, that's not really different than what has happened to Disney in previous decades. As a company, Disney will keep changing and evolving, and some people will always be upset about that, but that's honestly just whatever. But it is interesting for me to think about how my relationship to Disney has changed since I was growing up. When I was a child, I empathized a lot with Disney princesses, but never really thought about Snow White that much. My attention was more to Ariel, Belle, and Mulan. These characters whose stories definitely featured romance, but ultimately had them wanting something more. And as I grew up and began discovering myself as a queer person, as a non-binary person, the vague longing felt even more intense. But then I came out as a trans woman and I started transitioning. And through my transition, I found that my gender expression is very, very binary. Now the world largely perceives me as I am, a straight woman, and the aspects of myself that didn't fit into the world before now have a place. In October, I went to Disneyland Paris and was surprised at how differently I experienced it. It was my first time really going as myself, post-transition and without a lot of the anxiety and gender dysphoria that clouded my life before bottom surgery. And when I rode the Snow White ride over and over again, I took so much solace in the familiar, the traditional. I loved that she wanted to fall in love. I used to dream about falling in love as well, and it reminded me of the first time I took John, my husband, to a Disney park. I texted my friend Caroline and said, I feel like a Disney princess. Back then, I think I was saying that as a way of approximating my experience as a non-binary person within an archetype. But on this trip, I felt like I had finally attained something that I didn't know was possible growing up. I had what I always wanted. For the first time in my life, I felt normal. And as euphoric as that felt, it was also a bit disturbing. I know the historical and contemporary tropes of queer people finding acceptance and then oppressing their own communities. And I also feel like my relationship with John will always be informed by us having met before I transition. But I think I've just been surprised to find that things I previously found restrictive can feel revolutionary in another light when I can pick them for myself. The past few months have been filled with uncertainty, pain, and euphoria, and learning to hold these feelings at the same time is something I didn't really anticipate. Transition is wonderful, but for me, it's also been traumatic. In order to piece my life back together again, I had to smash it to fucking pieces, and the act of doing that scarred me. And so I moved on, learning to write songs again, figuring out what to do next, and understanding how I could love again, both myself and others. And I couldn't stop thinking about Snow White. So I started writing a script, then threw it out and started over, only to do the same thing again a month later. And the video you're watching now is my third attempt to put together a video essay about Snow White. While working on this video, I went to visit John in the US. One day I followed him to his university job and noticed a painting on the wall in his office that I hadn't seen before. As it turns out, he bought it shortly after I came out to him as a trans woman.
So you got this painting shortly after I came out to you. What interested you about this? Like, what struck you about it?
The colors of it were really interesting to me, and the way it's painted and the way it's condensed the imagery from the movie into one square, and the mystery of the painting because Snow White doesn't have any eyes. And I feel like there's a sense of longing because the eyes aren't there, or I feel a sense of longing wanting to complete the painting, and the way that her face is turned towards the apple and she's smiling creates a little bit of joy and happiness, but you see that it's being held by the witch. And then there's also one hand of Snow White reaching down and touching the well. I think it's just the way that all these images are collaged in a way that's interesting as a design, but the presence of the witch's eyes above, Snow White with no eyes, and then the apple, and then the witch's hand. It forms this thrust that conveys like fear and anxiety and anticipation and happiness and all those things I think that we were both feeling that week that you told me that you were going to transition. I was happy for you, but I was also fearful about what was going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I remember you told me that something that struck you about this painting was that you saw like the naivete in Snow White as a character, like the witch tempting her, all these juxtapositions as kind of like similar to like the journey that I was about to go on.
Yes, definitely. I was fully supportive of your decision, but I also knew that you were going to encounter lots of hardships associated with it. And I think the apple has always been a symbol of that knowledge, that we seek it, but we also don't really know what it will bring. It just reminded me of the position we were both in, that we were both going into this not really knowing exactly what was going to happen. I think the painting to me, has beauty and fear and mystery and some joy in it too because of the colors. It was very captivating to me. It just summed up a moment in my life in a way that very few paintings have done, I think. Snow White sort of stumbles into this world and seems to find a place for herself. Just like you've found a place for yourself as a gay guy or a trans person, and then suddenly you saw this other way that was going to be transformational because it was your journey. I said, yeah, sure, that's great. And thinking of our journey, I thought it's going to be fine. I'm looking forward to the change. I think we both knew that we were embarking on changes at that point, And there was some worry about it, but also I knew how Snow White turned out.
The happy ending?
Yes, yeah. And so I wasn't really too worried. And that's what, I think the painting has this happiness in it because of the color and it's animated and things like that. But there's always, witches with apples in our way.
Putting this video together has been a very disjointed process, but honestly, that mirrors what my personal life in the last few months has been like as well. And throughout all of this, it's been kind of comforting to fixate on Snow White, to have something to focus on and look at from so many different angles. And as you've already seen, Disney's Snow White has had many different roles and meanings in the 86 years since its release. And with the new live-action one coming later this year, it doesn't seem like that will stop anytime soon. But that's actually not what interests me most about this movie. It took me a few months to figure it out, but I now know why I haven't been able to stop thinking about Snow White. Disney's Snow White is a movie about Frank Churchill. Frank Churchill was born in Rumford, Maine on October 20th, 1901. After his family moved to California when he was 4 years old, he got involved in music and eventually got his first job as a silent film accompanist when he was 15. After a brief stint at med school, he dropped out and worked as a pianist in Tijuana, Mexico and Tucson, Arizona, before moving back to California and beginning his career in Hollywood. Dick faced the audience during the filming of the scenes at the piano at which Dick sat, but the strings of the instruments were deadened with felt so that when Dick struck the keys, the strings would give forth no sound. And Frank Churchill, pianist in a Hollywood theater orchestra, sat at a real piano off stage and played the accompaniment while Johnny Morey sang. Dick merely faked the singing and playing, but he did it so beautifully that the results were convincing beyond doubt. While working as a pianist at the LA radio station KNX and recording for RKO Pictures, he met Walt Disney, who hired him in 1930. At the time, the company had recently lost their house composer Carl Stalling, the man responsible for the early Disney sound. Stalling was originally an improviser who, at the request of Walt, wrote music for 2 already released Mickey shorts. He later suggested that there should be shorts that didn't only use music, but were structured around it. This became what we now know as the Silly Symphonies series, which, along with the breakout success of Mickey Mouse, showed Disney finding its own footing as a studio in the early 30s. Stalling left to work with Warner Brothers, and Burt Lewis, who had already been at the company for a year, replaced him as musical director. He's another one of the composers who defined the early Disney sound, but it was Frank Churchill who would play a role in bringing Disney music to previously unheard of levels of fame. Disney's first hit song was Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf from The Three Little Pigs, which Churchill co-wrote with Anne Ronell.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf, big bad wolf, big bad wolf?
Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf became one of the biggest hits of 1933, with even the president FDR saying that the short was his favorite movie. And it had even more cultural significance during the Great Depression. The film was an escape for people wanting to forget about their lives, and the simple, encouraging story of the pigs defending themselves from the wolf became a clear metaphor for many about U.S. society of the time. Believe it or not, Bob, my 3 Little Pigs have ended the Depression, Walt Disney confided to me yesterday. The biggest hit of any cartoon comedy ever made, if the fact that the picture has cleaned a cool $1 million means anything. And it's good for $500,000 more. Mickey Mouse is also helping Disney grow in popularity, but this was the first time that the company not only had a hit short, but also a hit song to go along with it. And in the decades since, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf has not only remained one of the company's most well-known songs, but it's also had influence on pop culture. It showed that the music from Disney cartoons had some serious potential, and that was important, especially during a time when synchronized sound was a relatively new part of the industry. And so it makes sense that music would also take center stage in Disney's Snow White. The score for the movie was written by a few Disney composers and shows a lot of the late romantic style of music that would become associated with Disney princess movies for a few decades. However, I think the most interesting thing about the movie's music is the songwriting, which was done by Frank Churchill and Larry Morey and borrowed from popular music styles of the day, namely musical theater and operetta. And the songs themselves don't just accompany the film, they add another dimension to it. Wants and desires are communicated through wistful melodies and make it even easier for the audience to empathize with Snow White's ambitions. And that paved the way for the strong musical theater influence on Disney music. There are some ensemble numbers that aren't as narrative-driven, but many of the songs push the story forward and reveal something about the characters, following in the footsteps of the then-developing genre of book musicals, aka shows where numbers are integrated into the story to tell an overarching narrative.
Make a wish into the well, that's all you have to do. And if you hear it echoing, your wish will soon come true.
And in the decades since, it's easy to see how this impacted Disney moving forward. music became an essential part of Disney animated movies, and though its role would be interpreted in a few different ways, animated musicals would become basically synonymous with Disney in the mainstream. So when Howard Ashman came along in the late 80s and pointed out the similarities between the development of Disney movies and US American musical theater, the company went back to its roots and embraced that relationship, and after the success of The Little Mermaid, Disney musicals have generally kept that going. Though people use the term I Want Song now, often in reference to Ashman's influence, it's important to note that like many musical terms, it was coined in retrospect to describe a trend. It's not like it was a known trope that was always used the same way, and Ashman pointed that out himself.
This is a classic kind of song. The Venus of Wishes one, Snow White, somehow they got away with two. I'm Wishing and Someday My Prince are exactly the same song.
The appeal of Snow White's songs would go beyond musical theater, though. A few songs from the movie became jazz standards. And even today, the songs are one of the most iconic parts of Disney's Snow White, to the point where one of the most identifiable parts of Snow White as a character is her singing.
Says we all sing a happy little working song.
Together, Larry Morey and Frank Churchill reportedly wrote around 25 songs for the movie, most of which are still unknown to the public. However, some outtakes have been released, showing the influence they may have had on the final film.
You're never too old to be young. You're never too old to be young.
Just like the animation immersed audiences in a world they hadn't seen before, the songs that made it into the final film showed the beating heart underneath the story. You don't have to be in Snow White's exact position to feel for her and to see yourself reflected in her wants and dreams.
I'm wishing for the one I love to find me today. I'm hoping and I'm dreaming of the nice thing he'll say. Ha 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 ha. Ha 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 I'm wishing for the one I love to find me today.
Snow White's soundtrack was not only impressive for the time, but it was the first film soundtrack to be commercially released, setting a new industry standard, and the songs remain some of the most beloved Disney songs of all time. But unfortunately, Frank Churchill's legacy is not as well known. After Snow White, he continued working for Disney, but allegedly had some disagreements with Walt over his contributions for the Bambi soundtrack. In the Neil Gabler biography on Walt, he wrote that Churchill had written a great score for the musical Circle of Hollywood, Walt griped, but one that was monotonous and did not provide the excitement the movie needed. And on May 14, 1942, at the age of 40, he was discovered dead at his home with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. According to his wife, his suicide note said, "Dear Carolyn, my nerves have completely left me. Please forgive me for this awful act. It seems the only way I can cure myself. I'm sorry. Put me to bed." One of his last wishes was to dedicate the song Love Is a Song to his wife, something that, according to rumors, was not honored by Walt. But what's omitted from this is that reportedly the song had already been submitted for publication when Churchill had asked. Whether or not that's true remains to be seen, as there is really no evidence either way. So there's the rumor that Walt drove Churchill to suicide, and then there's another rumor that it had nothing to do with Walt and that Churchill killed himself because of his struggle with alcoholism and the recent deaths of close friends. Some people also reference familial turmoil, as in his will he only left $1 to his daughter, allegedly because she didn't accept his guidance. But to be honest, there isn't any evidence to conclusively say why he did it, and I don't really think it's respectful to speculate. Frank Churchill's career ended in tragedy, and it's honestly heartbreaking for me to think about how the man who brought so much beauty into the world was struggling so much. And when looking at the history of the Disney company since then, it's clear just how big his influence was. The style of music used in Snow White set a template for Disney animated musicals that would be used for decades to come. And even though the company has evolved throughout the years, the soundtrack is still a backbone of the company's Disney Princess brand. For me, above all, Disney's Snow White is a movie about music. It had an influence on many parts of the film industry and took animation to new heights, but for me, the soul of the movie comes from the soundtrack. And that's why I haven't been able to stop thinking about Snow White since August. To be honest, when I started making videos a few years ago, I didn't expect it to become such a big part of my life. I had mainly focused on music, so it felt like making videos was just a side thing, but then the inverse happened, and I barely wrote songs for a few years. But now that I took a step back and reassessed why I'm doing this in the first place, I realized it doesn't have to be one or the other. I can write songs for my videos, I can take more time and record soundtracks, and my videos don't have to be this thing that's separate from the music I do, but something that's a part of my process. And the thing I love most about making videos is doing all of that while highlighting parts of culture and history that I think deserve more attention. So that's what I'll be doing on this channel. It won't all be about Disney, but I hope you join me anyway.